Thank you for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to discussions afterwards, so I hope you stay for that. My name is Samaneh Moafi. I'm a researcher in forensic architecture. I think that you're familiar with what we're doing. There is the kind of like a selection of our work is being exhibited here in Buck. So I won't spend much time explaining us, but basically we're a research agency. We're based in Goldsmiths University in London, and what we do is that we take independent research or act on commissions to investigate state or corporate violence when it bears upon the built environment. And it's an investigative practice in the sense that it kind of like it engages with architectural evidence and its presentation in political and legal forums, in truth commissions, courts, and human rights violations. Before I'm going to talk about an exhibition, a part of one of the projects that we're showing upstairs, but before that, I want to talk about this image, which you also see at the beginning of the exhibition. In 1984, the Brazilian police discovered in the suburbs of Sao Paulo human remains that were claimed to be those of Joseph Mengele, the executioner of Auschwitz. The best forensic experts worldwide were appointed to examine and identify the skeleton. Richard Helmer, a German pathologist, developed a particular video technique, which you can see here on the screen, where he kind of superimposed the skull on top of the face of Mengele, Joseph Mengele, and the kind of like it's a slide thing, so that like they superimpose, one fades away, the other fades in, or like kind of like it slides on from the top bottom to the left right. Because he said, because the skull, he explained, provided the underlying architecture of the face. The characteristics of the eyebrows, the position of the corner of the eye, the opening of auditory canal, the shape of the nose, the insertion of the nose wings, and the width of the mouth are each consistent between the topographic position of soft tissue and the architecture of the bones of the skull. This particular technique of skull-face superimposition was then later on used for identifying the victims of the genocide. So it was kind of like used in other kind of cases. And this was what Eyal Weizman, the director of forensic architecture, and Thomas Kinnan frame as the kind of like the forensic turn of the 20th century, this particular technique. And our work is very much kind of like builds upon this particular type of turn. Only instead of the skull, we look at the built environment. And I think this becomes kind of like more clear in the case that I'm going to show. In 2015, over 21,000 square kilometers of forest and peatlands in the Indonesian territories of Kalimantan and Sumatra were consumed by fires. Fumes from these fires combined into a massive cloud a few hundred kilometers long and a few kilometers thick. The cloud contained more carbon, methane, ammonium, and cyanide than those produced by the entire annual emission of German or British or Japanese industries. The cloud covered a zone that extended out of Indonesia to Malaysia, Singapore, southern Thailand, and Vietnam. In Malaysia and Singapore, schools were closed down. Airports in Philippines were shut down. In Vietnam, residents were told to stay home. In Thailand, there were reports of nose bleeding and sneezing. In Indonesia, there were something like 140,000 people who reported themselves to the hospital. In this context, international lawyer Balthazar Garzon's foundation, FIPGAR, commissioned forensic architecture to gather evidence for the causes and consequences of these forest fires, with the aim of an international trial. in a number of states worldwide. Universal jurisdiction is a particular thing that kind of like we were trying to work with, which allows for claiming criminal justice over an accused body, regardless of where the crime was committed and regardless of the criminal's nationality. Crimes that fit within this category are considered to be crimes against all. For example, genocide lies in this category, and the case of Mengele. And so we thought that we could introduce a new type of crime to this particular type of jurisdiction. An ecocide, a term that Polly Higgins uses in her proposal for the Rome Statute. Like the case of genocide, we had to prove that the destruction of ecosystem here has been both systematic and intentional. Right, and we weren't kind of like trying to focus on the casualties, as in like dead bodies as a result of these fires, but actually kind of like the ecosystem itself. International jurisdiction. This is a picture of the globe in the month of October 2015. It shows carbon monoxide in the troposphere. It's measured by the MOPIT sensor of NASA's Terra satellite. And so what we did with it is that we colored it in such a way that the yellow is showing the low concentration of carbon monoxide, the red is showing the highest concentration, and the white bits are where there is a cloud coverage, so the sensor cannot kind of like really detect. And the kind of like the corner over there is where Indonesia is located, no? So you see a big cloud of carbon monoxide over Indonesia, one over South Africa, and one on the Amazon. And it's a particular time of the year. It kind of like corresponds to the harvest season. What did these pixels really mean? How could we prove that they're not always there, that it's a very particular kind of like thing that happened at this particular point, and that they corresponded to the forest fires? How can we kind of like establish that? So we went a bit back. We went to the month of January, and what we did is that we kind of like we gathered this we looked at these detections of this Terra satellite on monthly basis, and then we superimposed this data with another set of data. Which our collaborator in this investigation, Wally in Kalimantan, kind of like gave us. It's the geolocation of sources of fire as they're detected by Wally on daily basis. And so we thought that if we kind of like superimpose the two on top of each other, is there a correlation between them? Is there a case when you have more and more fire, then there is kind of like an increase in carbon monoxide? And we could see that. We could see that kind of like happening towards up until kind of like 15th of October. So there was a correlation between the two. We wanted to look a bit closer to Kalimantan. This is a kind of like a normal satellite image of this area. Below this cloud is the kind of like, these are the sources of fire that we were looking at in the bigger scale. And I want to kind of like go a bit deeper. So the land in Indonesia is quite particular. It's not normal earth, basically. It's peat. And peat has a very particular ecosystem. It's basically decaying vegetation. Its depth goes up to something like 10 meters or more. It forms in wetland conditions, but if it's dry, it becomes very good for cultivation. But also it becomes highly combustible, as it burns quite fast, and it burns quite deep because it's deep. It's kind of like tens of meters. The use of peatlands in Indonesia for industrial agriculture is something that actually began in the 1990s during Suharto's regime, with the points that kind of like he started this industrial plantation as a kind of a national project, and it began with the rice plantation, not with palm oil necessarily. And we thought that it would be interesting to kind of like start looking at that period. What you're looking at here is another false color image of in 1996 of part of this area. What you see, the violet colors are showing the area that is clear, the green, the green is showing areas that are healthy forests, and you can already see the drainage canals that are put in the peatlands to drain the peat out of any water that it has, so that they can then cultivate the land, right? And you can even see in these kind of like satellite images that are quite, I mean, they don't have a high resolution, but even in them, you can see the sources of fire, because it's a Landsat image, so it kind of like, it has one of its sensors only registers heat, and therefore it can kind of like see the larger spots where there is so much heat, and kind of like it can detect them, and you can see some of these. And so what happens with the mega rice plantation project is that it leads in 1997. It kind of like it goes out of hand, it burns quite fast, the fires go out of hand, and the whole project is kind of like, it's stopped, it's put on pause, because the government didn't know what to do. I mean, like and so the area was kind of like left alone. But then what happens is that less than 10 years afterwards, the exact same area, I mean, like I just zoomed out a little bit, is then used for palm oil plantation, the same region with the same techniques. So you can see again the drainage canals, and you can see the same technique of draining the peatland, of clearing the land, and then of course, I mean, like there's also all sorts of issues. These are not areas that are uninhabited. There are Dayak communities who've been living in this region, who have claims to the territory, and so there's also there's also a conflict over land ownership. So these two parts are areas where there's Dayak community that has claim over it, and you can see the plantation company that kind of like extends, that kind of like covers and claims more and more of the land, and buys it from the state, basically. And then kind of like they basically so this is kind of like, you looked at the period between 2006 and 2015 for this particular case. I'm gonna kind of like zoom out a bit. This is one of the pieces that you also see in the exhibition. What we did was that in the very early stages of the project, we thought that we would get a strip of land across Kalimantan, which kind of like goes from the mega rice project, which is kind of like on the far left, a national forest in the middle, and then oil palm plantations on the on my right. And what we did was that we tried to kind of like look into different times to see what we can see, if there is something odd that we can detect, and we could. So we did a particular technique that is called NBR, normalized burn ratio analysis, where you can where what you're detecting is the burn value that a satellite image can detect. And so, so we did these kind of readings. So you can see the kind of like the purple color is the highest burn ratio, and the black and white color in the background is areas where there is no burn value in the pixel. And then what we did was that we kind of like superimposed on top of it the boundaries of the plantation sites as we knew they existed, and we understood two things. So in this particular one, what we realized is that in quite many of the cases, you have burning happening actually outside the border of a plantation site, which we thought was quite odd. The other thing was that had to do with the permits. So we knew that there are several kind of like stages that the plantation owner has to go through. First is that, I mean, you have a permit to survey the land, and it goes through several stages until you can actually start plantation. And so in these cases, you know, the two cases that have a red border, the four cases really, we saw that the plantation has already began where the company did not have the papers to start the plantation. So we're really kind of like dealing with a problem of rule of law, as in there are legal frameworks, but they're not being kind of like exercised enough, and the state is not kind of like practicing these, it's not like pressing these penalties per se. We looked at a particular case kind of like more closely afterwards. I mean, this was kind of like a more general reading. We just wanted to like understand what are the things that we should be aware of. And this is a case that we worked on with Wally, which is one of the biggest NGOs in Indonesia, and it was against a company named West Agro. This is an area that they were interested in. I mean, it's all peatlands actually, but somehow they were given permission to start the land survey to see if they can start plantation there. And so there are 4 stages, right? So you start the land survey, you can't really do anything. Then you have a location permit, then you have a plantation permit, and then you can start the cultivation. So in 2006, they have a location, they have a surveying permit at this point, but you can already see a lot of kind of like fires in the region. It would be, I mean, that's what Wally was teaching us, that what they do is that they pay the local farmers to have very small lands, to kind of like already start burning the land. And so that would be kind of like the technique that they would exercise. But at this point, I mean, like legally, it's quite difficult to hold them liable. Later, in January 2007, we could see in our satellite image that there is a grid of kind of like canals on the top corner of the site. But this was quite illegal, because at this point they did not have even a location permit. It was 2 weeks after this image that they were given a location permit, not even a plantation permit, right? So there is kind of like clear evidence that they're skipping the stages that they have to legally go through. There was also, I mean, like, you know, through time, so in 2011, they have all the permits, they've started plantations throughout the site. There is already a conflict between a Dayak community that is living in the area and has kind of like claim over the area that has a green border. This is 2014, so they've already started the plantation. You see green because they're kind of like these, the palm oils have already grown. They're about 3 years old now. They're quite kind of like, they're getting a bit bigger and bigger. But already in this image, you can see that there are parts of here that you can see that they've started clearing the land outside the borders of the site. No, I'll kind of like I'll try to point out, like here and here. I mean, how is that the case? How could they do that? And what they do often is that they would start the burning, and then the fire would go, and oops, it burns a bit more, and that's not so bad, because, you know, there's more land that is now clear than what you know, like it's already cleared now. So later on, they could actually buy that land because it's already cleared. It's no longer forest, right? So it's kind of like it's intention. Like there is an intentionality kind of like to it. We were interested in. If this is systematic, I mean, I said intentionality, and if it is systematic. So we looked at other kinds of plantation sites that this particular company owns. these are the kind of like 3 groups of plantation that it owns in this region. The ones that are marked in red are plantation sites that have a case in court, and you can see that in all 3 groups that Best Agro has a site, all 3 of them have a case in court. So there is something that, you know, like this company is systematic across all the sites that this company holds. The second case that we're trying to look at, we try to look at it slightly differently, with a different lens. We try to look at moratoriums, so the forests. As in, we were really trying to force ourselves outside this kind of like looking at humans as casualties. I mean, what are the other kinds of casualties that we can look at? And we looked at the moratoriums because they're inhabited. I mean, of course they're inhabited. And one of the species that you could say is the orangutan that lives kind of like in these that lives in the forests, and they really kind of like, they have a very humanly way of inhabiting the forest. It's always a mother, sometimes with a baby, who builds a nest, and there is a kind of a logic to the way they build the nest. So they use the bigger branches to build the kind of like the structure of the nest, and the smaller leaves and stuff to make it a bit softer so they can live in it. They would never stay in one nest more than a night. They would kind of like put it on one night, and then the next day they would leave it, and so on and so forth. And really, I mean, orangutan is an interesting figure. It's really a kind of a threshold figure, if you like, between human and nature. To say one of the thresholds that you could say. And Eyal uses the example, the relationship between the orangutan and stick to kind of like describe this. So you have kind of like in the 18th century, you have the orangutan kind of like very humanly standing like a human, holding the stick as a human would, standing on a land that is kind of like looks like an agricultural land, as if he knows how to kind of like use the forest, use the nature. Then somehow later on he's being pushed back into the forest, into nature. He becomes a bit more kind of like wild, if you like, you know, like it's like there's everything is so leafy. He's kind of like being pushed back. And then this is an image that Eyal took during the field work that we were doing. And it's an image of one of these branches, the way that it's brought down to kind of like do a knot, so that then on top of it you could build the nest. So you can really come in, I mean, like he can be pushed back, brought back into the kind of like the threshold of being a human, right? Is he really part of a nature, or is he really a human? I mean, where does he really stand? And he's also a threshold figure in the future of law, if you like. We looked at a case of Sandra. She's an old orangutan living in Buenos Aires in a zoo. She's very old. I mean, she was actually born in Germany, then sent to Buenos Aires. And it's a case where the zoo is being closed down, it's being shut down. But she's too old to be moved out, right? As in, if you move her out, she would definitely die. And so there was a case of what are we going to do with her? And so this is a case that we looked very closely at together with M7 Red, Mauricio Corbalán, who's based in Buenos Aires. And so what happens is that a judge issues a habeas corpus for Sandra, which is kind of like already a sign of recognizing her as a subject of law, not an object of law. And a habeas corpus is something that you issue for missing bodies, per se. And this is an image of the court where you have scientists, anthropologists, the kind of like the mayor of the city, the keeper of Sandra, kind of like all of them kind of like coming together, discussing whether she's a sentient being, whether she has rights to stay in her cage, as in, or if she can be moved or not. One of the things that they present in the court is the thing that scientists in Max Planck Institute present, and it's a case where they're trying to prove that orangutan is a sentient being. So what they do is that they call it a peanut test. So there's a tube, and they put a peanut in it. And the orangutan is trying to take away the peanut, but he can't. And so he goes back to the back of the room, he brings water, and he pours it with his mouth into the tube until slowly the peanut kind of like floats on top of the water and slowly comes up, and then he can eat it. No, he understands how to reach the peanut. The other test that they do is something that is called the liquid test, where they like it's about, like, they're trying to test, it's the same glass first with two different kinds of amounts of liquid in them, and she recognizes which one is bigger amount of liquid. Then they put it in different types of glasses, so the one that had less liquid looks higher, and they show it to her, and she still can recognize which one is the higher amount of the bigger amount of liquid. And so, like, I mean, these are the tests that are kind of like that are used to say whether she is sentient or not. And so with that, we were kind of like interested in if there is casualty of orangutans, and what kinds of casualties are related to these palm oil plantations. We looked at a particular company called Bumitama, together with Center for Orangutan Protection in Indonesia. These are all the sites that Bumitama owns in the region, and we were kind of like interested in the orangutan, right? So we were looking at those that are at the border with moratoriums. The green ones are the moratoriums, the forests. So we looked at these three. This is one of the cases. What you can see, the areas that these are the kind of like the yellow are the borders of plantation sites, and the four red dots are areas where there had been a case of an orangutan casualty. This is an X-ray of a punk, a baby orangutan who was shot by a bullet, and you can see the bullet inside her body. I mean, are we looking at an X-ray of a human, or are we looking at an X-ray of a piece of nature? I mean, what are we looking at? This is the area where a pung was found, which is in itself, I mean, a pung is a threshold figure, right? I was trying to say, is he human, is he nature? And he was found in this funny threshold border between the forest and the plantation sites. Of course, he wouldn't understand where this border really is. I mean, he's not allowed to enter particular area where there is kind of like a slightly different type of trees. Why wouldn't he be allowed, no? And this was also the case for the other sites that we were looking at. This is again, I mean, the one at the bottom is the site that Bumitama owns, and the four circles or areas where they had found remains of orangutan, and I mean, the fact that always the remains are found on the borders of a plantation site already shows intentionality, or like they're aware of what they're doing. They're aware that that this is something wrong, that it has to be put on the border outside the boundary, that they do not want that to be inside the boundary, because then they would be held liable. This is the skull of an orangutan who was found in one of these, in one of the 4 locations that I showed you, and it's an interesting image. I mean, you're looking at the skull. You're looking at a human hand that is kind of like holding a GPS location that is positioning the skull in the kind of like the scale of the globe, in relation to the planets, and yeah, and like I started the presentation with the skull of Joseph Mengele, and I want to kind of like end it with the skull of an orangutan. If the skull of Mengele signified a genocide and marked the forensic turn of the 20th century, can we think of the skull of orangutan as one that signifies an ecocide and marks the forensic turn of the 21st century? Maybe. And so this case of ecocide in Indonesia, it's a case that is ongoing. We have not been able to bring it to court. Hopefully we will. But it kind of like sits within a kind of like larger body of cases that we're trying to look at, and we call this Center for Contemporary Nature, and in it, the kind of like overarching idea for it is that the environment, whether built, natural, or the kind of like the entanglement of the two, is not a neutral background anymore. Its destruction is not always the unintended collateral damage of attacks aimed at other things. In many cases, environmental destruction is actually the means, the weapon by which belligerents pursue their aims. And so it's about kind of like thinking about this new environment, this new conception of environment, this new reading of nature. That's what kind of like this greater body of work is trying to do. Yes, sorry, I'll end here. Thanks.
Okay.